each moment. When I'm speaking to you now, for example, there's a part of that in which I'm aware of my own inner feelings and maybe anxieties, and there's another part of it which is only possible because I'm engaged in a conversation with another person. And you can never step out of all of that. Even the hermit living in the middle of nowhere is still acutely aware that he or she is a social being. The very language that forms in our solitary mind is not ours. It's the language of our community, of our culture. The terms within which we think are those of our religion or philosophy. In other words, you cannot escape yourself. It's impossible. You cannot step away from your embeddedness in life.
I'm Krista Tippett, and this is On Being. Today with Buddhist teacher and scholar Stephen Batchelor. Reading his book on the art of solitude brought to mind for me the poet Rilke's reflections on the importance of solitude, even and precisely for relationships. In his Letters to a Young Poet, Rilke wrote that a good marriage is one in which each partner appoints the other to be the guardian of their solitude, and thus they show each other the greatest possible trust. I'm thinking about Rilke writing to his young poet about not rushing into relationship because, you know, that the deep relationship will be two solitudes saluting each other, right? Which many of us learn the hard way as we go through life with broken relationships, that we actually needed to be at home in ourselves before we can actually be at home with another. Which I guess is another paradox here at the heart of this conversation we're having.
It is certainly another paradox, and I think a very important one. And I worry about how, with social media and so forth, people are having less and less and less time to really value with themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that is true. My own training as a monk in contemplative traditions has not made me become sort of isolated and introspective and sort of wary of other people, very much the opposite. I find that having that groundedness, that sort of a basic sense of being okay, of being at home with myself, is the foundation from which I can then, as it were, really communicate more authentically and more directly with others. I'm not concerned about what they think about me or what they are going to say or what they want, but I have a resource within myself that is my own, deeply earned truth, if you like, or integrity. And that's where I live, not just for me, but it's only meaningful in the sense that can become the foundation for how I interact and relate to those who are close to me, of course, but also in my work situations. And I think also, much more broadly than that, through literature, through art, in which we seek to somehow communicate these values, or I seek somehow to communicate what I've learned, and make it somehow transparent and available and important for other people.
I think that was such an excellent description of the very practical benefits of walking with solitude rather than resisting it.
Yes.
I wanted to actually just open up your book and read. So Montaigne is one of your teachers, companions in this solitude project.
Damn.
Would that be a fair way to say that?
What the hell is this?
Montaigne is one of my guiding lights.
One of your guiding lights. So here's some of the things that he wrote.
This is how she's supposed to look.
Hundreds of 400
Who the
years
hell
ago.
are you?
Thinking about these very things. I've just marked a few of them.
What are you talking about?
That is why it is not enough to remove oneself from people, not enough to go somewhere else. We have to remove ourselves from the habits of the populace that are within us.
Yes.
We have to isolate our own self and return it to our possession. Here's something else. The greatest thing in the world is to know how to be yourself.
Yes.
Here's another one. He said, we have a soul that can turn in on itself. It can keep itself company. It has the means to attack and defend, to give and receive. Don't worry that solitude will find you hunched up in boredom. And I do actually think that for 21st century people, that would be a fear if you say, be more solitary.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. No, it is. It's scary for people.
Mm-hmm.
Even when I lead meditation retreats and we ask people to enter silence, for some people that is utterly terrifying. The fact that you can't communicate with someone, that you somehow have to just be within yourself, means you somehow are no longer allowed to sort of leach out into the world. Montaigne uses this expression. He says that our lives are always leaking away. We're like a barrel that's got lots of leaks in it, and we're constantly sort of spilling out into the social and the other world. And again, if you think of social media, that's what it's like. And the practice of solitude, as Montaigne puts it so very well in the passage you read, is to somehow bring all that back into ourselves, to not let our emotions and our thoughts just sort of dissipate out into the world, but to gain some way in which we harness those energies, we return them to our own inner awareness, inner consciousness, and we become therefore much more careful and much more caring as to how we do express ourselves. Solitude actually establishes the foundation for, rather than just saying the first thing that comes into your head and letting it blather out into the world, we actually take a more reasoned and reflective, a calmer, a slower way of saying and acting in ways that hopefully others will find of value. And so once again, solitude, interaction, in the end, turn out to be two parts of the same experience.
Yeah, here's the passage you just noted from Montaigne, and where he continues, which I will say, I read this following on what you just said, and it reads so differently in this time where we have so many distractions, right? So he said, recover your mind and your will, which are busying themselves elsewhere. You are draining away and scattering yourself. Concentrate yourself. Hold yourself back. You are being betrayed, dissipated, robbed.
Yeah, exactly. And what I found particularly striking is that Montaigne had no knowledge whatsoever of Buddhism. He doesn't use the words meditation at all. But when I read Montaigne through my Buddhist spectacles, I'm astonished that how much he somehow stumbled across through his own inquiries and through his own reading of Greek philosophy, that brings us to insights that are completely in accord with what you'll find in a book on mindfulness. I find that striking. I find that what that points to is there's some commonality in human inwardness, whether you're a Buddhist or you're a Roman Catholic like Montaigne, that if you pay attention to your inwardness, you'll start coming up with very similar insights. You'll even start using a similar kind of language. And that's one of the things that really struck me.
And, I think I want to just spend a little bit of time on a paradox that's kind of running through all of this, which is at one and the same time we're speaking of becoming at home in oneself, with one's interiority, with one's interior worlds, with, an inner ease. And the reality that you also write about so well, and that we actually all know, whether we've thought about it in this context or not, is that the world inside us is a very complex, often troubled place. Which is why, for you, that we spoke in the beginning about how to be alone, to be at home in ourselves, is something that I think human beings, we are all drawn to and yet terrified of. And that's why when we do have teachers and tools, that we need that you use the word training early on.
Yes. No, that to me, I think, is also absolutely central to my exploration of solitude, is my having been introduced to tools, contemplative tools, that we can actually use to practice solitude. There's a danger, I think, of thinking of solitude as some kind of place, some kind of space within us. Whereas I feel that when you start to think of it as a practice, as a training, then that practice, and it might be doing mindfulness meditation 20 minutes a day, or whatever it is that we actually start sculpting, I would say, refining, shaping the contours of our inwardness, the contours of our interiority. And that's a lot of work, because, as Montaigne and the Buddha both pointed out, there's all of these fantasies and paranoid thoughts and deep emotions and fears that are constantly crowding out, they're taking over. It's very difficult to be inwardly still.
Yes.
Anyone who's tried meditation thinks, oh, that sounds really nice. Yeah, I'll go and sit quietly, close my eyes, and watch my breath, and the next, 2 nanoseconds later, you've been overtaken by...
Right.
Yeah, you've been overtaken any kind of nonsense that's running through your mind. So you realise, and I realised this at a young age,
What it do?
18, 19 years
It's
old,
your
that I
boy
had no
Zoe.Cartier.
mastery
Doing
or
what I
control
do
over my
best.
inner
I'm
processes
in the
whatsoever.
Doing my
And yet
thing.
I had this
Feeling like
egotistic
the crowd
conceit that
boxing
I was the
in
guy in
game.
charge.
Hey,
And that
whoa,
is, again, I
hey.
think, something we, in our society,
Hey.
we're strong egos, responsible, blah, blah, blah. But actually, when you stop and look at what's actually going on inside you, that whole notion of being the CEO of your mind begins to disintegrate very fast.
What up, man?
And
I'm in the game.
So if we're going to work with that, as Montaigne recognized, this was Montaigne's great discovery. He goes into his lovely little tower
I'm in the game,
to
man.
spend his
Can you
time
hang,
alone
Jermaine?
in solitude, and all hell
Vibing
breaks
in my
loose.
hood.
He said, my mind was
Look
like
at my
sort of
diamonds.
galloping horses or something like that, over which I had no
Look at my
control.
diamonds. Come and see.
It threw him into a
Show you my
depression.
diamonds.
And the way he got out of that depression was by carefully analysing what was actually going on in his thoughts and feelings and emotions.
My diamonds.
Solitude is something you refine and
I just
develop
made
and
'em.
create. And again,
This
I
one?
think crucial.
don't know
It has
about
to
her.
do with
This
refining
one?
our ethical
Boy, she
intelligence.
bad.
It has to do with refining our capacity
Damn,
to
you
see
bad,
where
baby.
our impulses are
How
coming
could you
from,
touch you?
to what extent those impulses are just
touch
driven
you?
by
Let me just
conditioning
wipe
and
it.
habit and
Yeah.
fear, and to what extent we can
Yeah.
somehow open
It's
up
me,
a
baby.
non-reactive
Yeah, me.
space within us from
Yeah,
which
me.
we can respond
Want
to
a close
the
up?
respond
My
to our
bad
own
girl.
needs
I
too,
don't know about
but
this
in
one.
a way that's not
She bad.
driven by
Yeah.
familiar habit patterns, which are often rooted in attachment and fear and other things. So solitude, the practice of solitude, is the practice of creating an inward autonomy within ourselves, an inward freedom from the power of these overwhelming thoughts and emotions.
I'm really drawn to the language used of this is ethical intelligence, this inner work, and not merely emotional intelligence, but that in fact, to the extent that we cultivate what I think is what would more commonly in this culture be described as emotional intelligence, that becomes ethical intelligence, applied ethical intelligence.
Absolutely. Our own interiority is a field of ethical behavior. In other words, when we practice mindfulness, we feel that we recognize that we're confronted with a choice to go along with the fantasy that's about to burst out or not. That's an ethical choice. I'm actually saying it's better to not get caught up in that story. It's better, I'm preferring, to choose to be still and to let that go. That, I think, is where the point where ethics truly begins. And we don't have really a language for an inner ethic. And solitude, I think, provides us with a frame in which we can start talking about that.
After a short break, more with Stephen Batchelor. You can always listen again and hear the unedited version of every show we do on the On Being podcast feed, wherever podcasts are found.
Support for On Being with Krista Tippett comes from the Fetzer Institute, helping build the spiritual foundation for a loving world. Learn more at Fetzer.org.
Thank you for tuning in on this Sunday morning for this episode of On Being. You're listening to South Florida's only NPR news source. We're 91.3 WLRN, 91.5 in the Keys, and 101.9 in the Palm Beaches. On Being returns in just a moment. Stay with us.
The Children's Services Council of Broward County helps transform the lives of 1 in every 3 children in Broward. The vision of the Children's Services Council is to ensure that all children shall have the opportunity to realize their full potential, their hopes, and their dreams, supported by a nurturing family and community. For updates and information related to resources available during the COVID-19 crisis, you can visit cscbroward.org. Our focus is our children.
We're funded by WLRN members and by Going Gone Junk Removal, serving Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade counties for 10 years, specializing in bulk pickups for apartment and HOA communities with dumpster areas. 561-777-7779.
I'm Krista Tippett, and this is On Being. Today, exploring the difference between loneliness and finding ease in aloneness. How to practice a life-giving solitude. Stephen Batchelor is a Buddhist teacher and scholar who's just written a lyrical book called The Art of Solitude. You know, one thing that's striking me, I mean, you are British, I'm American, we're both white Western people of the, I don't know, Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment West.
Yes.
I feel that what you're describing is something that so many people are ready to make, although it's hard work, so we have to talk about what the work is, right? But that we're actually working our way back to something that is natural and innate, that we kind of skewed. And I don't know, have you thought about this question of the West?
Yes, I have. And one of the things that I find striking about Montaigne is that he's drawing his philosophy, and in many ways his whole language of solitude, the language of the essays, is deeply influenced particularly by the early Greek philosophy of skepticism, or the figure of Socrates, but particularly the skeptics. And he's tapping into a current of thinking and behaving that would have been very, very similar to the world of the Buddha and other sages and teachers of India of that period. And so what I feel I've been led to is a falling away of the notion of a distinction between the West and the East. We find the Buddha, who's not a Westerner remotely, he's talking of Chitta Viveka and Kaya Viveka, which means inner solitude as opposed to outer solitude. We find the Buddha
What is outer solitude? What is that?
Well, outer solitude is when you go off to the top of the mountain and you sit in a cave, and basically your mind is a complete chaotic mess, but you are physically
solitude in body only.
Solitude in body only.
Okay,
exactly.
all right.
That's of course that's dead easy. Anyone can do that.
Now, you are no longer a monk. Is that correct? And
That's correct.
You married, and I guess what I want to get at is how the move from this exploration began in a monastic context. And now for a number of years you have lived it in the context of being a married man, living more fully in society. So how has that reshaped, informed your solitude project?
Well, I was a monk for 10 years, from the age of 20 to 30 basically. And then I disrobed and I married. But I married a former nun.
Oh, okay.
And I found that to be not at all somehow in opposition to my deepest values and practices and so on, but actually has provided a very rich environment to explore solitude and meditation in a completely non-monastic environment. I think a monastic environment today is largely of value because it affords us a kind of education and training in interiority. So again, it goes back to this question of education. If we were to become a society in which we would educate our children from a young age to become conscious of their interiority, their solitude, their aloneness, and to give them tools and practices And nowadays in some schools they are introducing mindfulness.
It is starting, yeah.
It's beginning to happen.
Yeah.
Then I think, the need to have separate communities apart from society where these things are taught may become less and less needed. And so I would like to think of a monastic training as becoming, let's say, an alternative to doing a degree course at a university. For some people, these would be the skills they would wish to train in. They could then become meditation teachers. They could
ethical intelligence.
In ethical
masters of ethical intelligence.
Masters in ethical intelligence.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned Rilke's To Solitude Saluting. I just wonder very practically in the context of marriage, and as you said, you're married to somebody who has also cultivated solitude, interior life, inwardness. How do you think about the compatibility, or like what is the synergy between a developed solitude and a functioning marriage?
Well, I think it helps a lot, frankly. I think not only in my marriage, but also in many of my relationships with friends and others, that this kind of training does, I feel, allow us to respond more to the other person rather than just react. I think is a crucial distinction. Solitude and cultivating solitude is basically learning how to be less reactive, and that's where emotional intelligence comes in. Emotional intelligence is an intelligence that seeks to respond to the situation from a non-reactive space, and that non-reactive space is solitude/nirvana.
Okay.
Nirvana is not, maybe I should clarify that. Nirvana is not some Buddhist heaven somewhere, some place you go to after you die, or some deep mystical experience you might, if you're lucky, land in one day. But nirvana, as the Buddha defined it, is simply the absence of greed, absence of dislike, and absence of egoism. In other words, it is described as a kind of, it's a solitude in which you're not being crowded out by your attachments and your fears and your egoistic confusions. That's what you're solitary from. See, in Tibetan and some of these Asian languages, you can use solitude as a verb. You can say, I'm solitary of anger, which means I'm empty of anger. If you look it up, the word solitude, and look it up in a Tibetan dictionary, it gives us as a synonym emptiness.
That's really interesting too, because to me, the language of to be solitary of, as opposed to how the word emptiness strikes me in English, is that to be solitary, it has more agency, this solitariness, right? And it's not a nothingness. It has agency and it has sovereignty.
That's right, exactly. And when I first started studying Buddhism when I was a young man, the point that my teachers made again and again and again and again was, when we talk about emptiness, we don't just mean a sort of a void. Emptiness is only meaningful as an emptiness of something. It's a relative term. It's not an absolute term. You're empty of attachment. Okay. You're empty of a particular opinion. And so perhaps a better way to render that in English would be to talk of this as a process of emptying, to think of it as a verb. In other words, we empty our minds of our greed and our hatred and our attachment. We don't empty our minds of generosity and love and wisdom.
Right.
You have to differentiate in solitude what it is that you're letting go of and what it is you're allowing the space for. Right. The problem with anger and hatred and fear and so on is that not that they are uncomfortable and pleasant and often cause a lot of grief. The other problem is they block us from doing anything else. They literally crowd our minds to such a point that we can't really even conceive in that moment of an alternative response.
Right. I was thinking about how I was just having this conversation with somebody about forgiveness, which sounds like something you've done for someone else, but in fact it's something you do for yourself, to not be obsessed, right? It's a way of emptying yourself of reactions and grievance that are only doing you harm.
I never thought of it like that, but that's absolutely right.
Mm.
If you forgive, you're actually letting go of something.
Mm-hmm.
You're letting go of a grudge or a resentment.
Mm-hmm.
And in releasing that, you are freeing yourself to think
To
and
be,
feel and
yeah.
act and live differently.
Right.
And that's the case with solitude. You empty yourself of these things that are getting in your way, and that gives you the foundation for living differently. In other words, making different choices, leading an ethical life from a different perspective deep down within yourself.
I'm Krista Tippett, and this is On Being. Today exploring the art and practice of aloneness with Buddhist teacher and writer Stephen Batchelor. So somewhere you said that this art of solitude is
She has
it's
a
an embodied
penis,
inquiry.
man.
And I think, like, as we've walked through this, what you're describing is really the embodied inquiry of a lifetime, right? You never get perfect at this.
You'll never get this totally right, no.
But it would keep developing and evolving, hopefully getting richer.
Yeah.
Which is not to say, one thing I really enjoyed when I interviewed you years ago is your real reverence for, I wrote some of these, the massiveness of the questions, the mystery of existence and of what is inside us and of the world that only gets more mysterious the more closely you attend to it, how we and all of this is really so deeply surprising and odd, and that there's something so redemptive about just coming to expect that rather than resisting it or being surprised or shocked by it. And I feel like this practice of solitude is kind of this elemental way. It's like creating an elemental foundation in yourself to live that way.
I couldn't have put it better. That is creating an elemental foundation within yourself to live in a way where you're opening the capacity to respond wisely, or more wisely, let's say, more lovingly, more caringly to the situation at hand. But again, as an ethical choice you're making, it also has an element of risk. You cannot know in advance what is the right thing,
Right.
that your actions or your words will have the effect you wish. You're basically throwing something that you are called upon to say or to do. And hopefully that will make an improvement in the world, but it may not. You might get it wrong. And that then will feed back into your reflective life as to try to understand better the consequences of what you said or did. And in that sense, it's a constant, ongoing ethical inquiry and refinement of a sensibility that will always be with us, because perfection in human life, I think, is a pipe dream. That life is constantly throwing us situations that we could not conceivably have foreseen. Our body gets sick, breaks down, all of these things, and at each moment in our existence, we're constantly aware that we're faced with choices. It's always a challenge. It's always, our lives are always a work in progress.
Yeah.
We are unfinished projects, and will still be an unfinished project when we die.
Yes.
But that is what gives this whole way of living its urgency, its dynamism, and also I think its deep joy, its deep sense of flourishing as a person.
Yeah, there's nothing static about this. I think somewhere you mentioned, a couple of people you mentioned that Nelson Mandela, in his enforced solitude of prison, how that formed him, which I hadn't heard before, his sense of the power of words, actually.
Yeah, exactly. It's a statement he made in a speech he gave somewhere. It's not in one of his books. I think it's a very beautiful passage, because it shows that this solitude, which clearly wasn't chosen in his case, it was the last thing he
It was
wanted.
enforced. Yes.
And it was totally enforced.
Yeah.
27 years of his life.
Right.
It was most active adult in solitude, and yet he's the kind of person who, rather than just becoming lonely and depressed, which I suspect would be a very reasonable way of reacting to that incarceration, he saw it as an opportunity. And what he discovers in the silence and the solitude is the power of words, and how powerful words are. Because this is what he's been cut off from.
Yes.
The capacity to be able to speak. And rather than just feel frustrated and limited, he reflects back on how valuable words are in being able to address people's real needs and concerns. And so he seems to have transformed that imprisonment, at least at one level, into a deeper resource within himself. And I think, when he is released from jail, and you hear him speak, there's a kind of there's a gravity and a maturity and a depth, and it doesn't really matter almost what he says. There's something in his tone of voice, something in his whole being that has been nurtured and enriched, it appears, from this long period of enforced solitude and reflection. This is Mandela. He says, "It is never my custom to use words lightly. If 27 years in prison have done anything to us, it was to use the silence of solitude to make us understand how precious words are and how real speech is in its impact on the way people live